As I look around the room, I see a lot of people who have contributed to this production today and who have supplied photos and information. I want to thank them, and you'll see some things that will be very familiar to you. First of all, the first black pioneer was John Thomas. He came in the year 115 years ago. His life was chronicled by Mary Dickinson for the WPA Writers Project during the 1930s. President Roosevelt had all sorts of programs to employ people. One of them was to employ writers, another one for artists. And Mary was a local realtor, a mother of George Dickinson and Bill Dickinson. Bill was mayor of Homestead. And she submitted her work to Tallahassee, written form. It was never typed up or anything, and then just maybe within the last 5 years, University of Miami professor Greg Bush discovered her handwritten notes in the archives, brought them home to us and shared with us. But John Thomas came to Miami in 1894, which was 2 years before Miami became an organized community. He was on the docks and he heard about the Cutler Trading Post. So he decided he'd give it a try, got on a boat, came down to Cutler, liked it, came over to the Cutler Bay, Cutler Ridge area where he worked for a big tomato grower, Thom Peters, for a while. And then he followed the trail from Cutler to Silver Palm. He went a little bit further west and found work at the Thom Brewer Homestead, which is at the corner of 248th and Redland Road. It's the northwest corner. And John did all sorts of work. He cleared land, cut wood, set out grows. And in 1900, before there was a homestead, before there was a railroad here for like 4 years before, he walked into what's now Homestead. And so he was really here in Homestead before there was such a place. One of his quotes was that he had a healthy respect for the Seminoles and he kept his distance. In his interview, was very important because he identified other earlier settlers. He really saw the area for what it was. He came for the first train arrival, which was December 15th in 1904 in Homestead. And he saw the first train pass through to Key West with Henry Flagler. I have Henry Brooker on the mind, to Key West in January of 1912. You have to think back to, this is the 1930s and what the area was like, and think about segregation. And here's what Mary Dickinson wrote about John Thomas. Again, please keep the era in mind. He and his wife Belle live in the Negro quarters of Homestead and are rated among the most substantial of the colored citizens. Thomas is an interesting and reliable source of information on local history, as he's witnessed each phase of the growth of the district. He was among the gala handful of settlers that flocked to the newly painted depot to see the first Florida East Coast train puff into Homestead on December 15, 1904. He saw the first through train to Key West puff through in 1912 and shared in the tensions of those days after the bank robbery on September 15, 1916, when posses were scouring the southern end of the state for the bandits. And again, this was written in the 1930s, handwritten form, put in the archives in Tallahassee and not seen until just recently. John and Belle Thomas lived in Homestead. They helped establish St. Paul's Missionary Baptist Church. Among other things, John was a fishing and hunting guide. He raised livestock. He was a modest and a very generous man. When he butchered, rather than personally carrying fresh meat to the widows in the community, he asked friends to do it so that he wouldn't be seen as self-serving. He was a highly respected man. In late 1903, going back a little bit in time here, 12 or more skilled Bahamian craftsmen arrived in Homestead. They lived in portable buildings, transportable buildings. It was like 4 walls and a roof that could be disassembled and put on the train and then moved down the line. They were supervised by William King, and they built 2 cottages, one for the station agent, one for the section foreman, and then they built the iconic FEC depot. And if you've ever been in the Florida Pioneer Museum, you can see the wonderful quality of their work. Here's the depot, as it looked in 1904. Here's a later picture of the depot, downtown Homestead. And here are the cottages. The one on the right is the one that's here in Florida City now as the Florida East Coast, Florida Pioneer Museum. The other building burned down later. A really, really important man in the history of the community is Lawrence Mark McLain. He came as a part of the survey team for the Florida East Coast Railway. He and other guys built a small chapel where the FEC depot ended up in downtown Homestead, and of course that had to be disassembled. Here's what was really important. He homesteaded 160 acres south of Maury and west of Chrome. Now what area is that? That's the southwest section of Homestead and the northwest section of Florida City. He donated 1 acre of land to St. Paul's Missionary Baptist Church. His wife was one of the people who helped establish St. Paul's. John and Belle Thomas were early supporters and funders. First pastor was William M. Baker in 11 to 14. And the current church as we see it was built in 1947, and it was built by a local contractor, Linton Connor. This is probably a 1960s, judging by the automobile there, picture of the church, and it looks much the same today. This is arguably the oldest church in the area in that it dates back to the church that was where the FEC depot ended up. This is an incredible picture. The museum just acquired this and maybe 10 or 11 others off of the internet. They were very, very expensive. This is a black family living in Florida City. By the house, and there's another picture of another family, we believe that this was a house built by the Florida Miami Land and Development Company, which owned the entire city of Florida City and all the way out to the bay. The picture was so expensive because anything collectible having to do with black families is very, very expensive. This collection had 2 pictures in it. They were taken by a man whose photo was in one of the other pictures. He was a single man who was a farmer down here, and it was just amazing that if you think back to the time, who owned a camera and where did he ever get film developed? It had to be like Miami, and it had to be like one place. But anyway, this is a family. And I just noticed today that the siding on the house almost looks like it's the leftovers from a sawmill. I forget what they called them. It was like the rounded part that was left over after they cut the lumber. The houses were, since they were alike, this is the second house. We believe it was really Miami Land and Development Company owned. The farmer was from New York, apparently, because the photos came from New York. And I would think they were probably mailed up like in 1911, 12, and put in somebody's attic, found and somehow identified as being from down here, and put on the internet. And it's pretty obvious it's a Sunday because everybody in all the pictures has their best clothes on. This is the second photo. This is not the same house because if you look at the trees, it's completely different. And this is a couple and their dog on the porch. And this is like a sawmill. This is definitely like sawmill ends there, that now they look at it really carefully. World War I was a very important time in our history. We entered the war late. The United States entered the war late. And our area was not involved as involved as some, like in the Midwest. We supplied a lot of men in uniform, but we did not supply agricultural produce the way the Midwest did. 35 black men from this area served in uniform. And then think about what the population was back then, very, very small. 5 of them died in uniform, and the names are there on the screen. 1 from Perrine, 1 from Homestead, 1 from Naranja, 1 from Princeton. This is Private Robert Jenkins in his uniform. We know a lot about the black community in this period, World War I, because A.C. Graw, who owned one of the two newspapers in town, reported on the black community the way he reported on the other community. And that had not happened until that time, and it didn't happen for a long, long time later. But the Red Cross unit was formed in May of 1918. Ida Logan was the chair, Georgia Jenkins vice chair, Carrie Batten was secretary, and here's an important name. Lizzie Melton was the treasurer. You'll see a picture of Lizzie later on. There were 28 members divided into teams. They made what was needed for the war in Europe, foot socks, knitted things. And then in 1918, for the first time ever, they named their Red Cross unit, and they named it the Colored Red Cross. Kind of a local project that same year was to make broths and delicacies for people who were under the weather. In December, they had a Christmas roll call, and this was what was used down here for probably 20 or 30 years. Any charity at Christmas time was called Christmas roll call, and the Rotarians were big on this. And this group raised funds in Homestead, Redland, and Florida City. Here are some of the names of the Red Cross members. I'm not going to go through them. A big, big employer. In fact, Dade County's largest employer was located in Princeton. On 80 acres in Princeton. It was owned by one man, Gaston Drake, who was a graduate of Princeton University, hence Princeton, Florida. The value of his property in 1912 was $100,000, which is a lot of money. He was the biggest employer with 200, and I would guess that of that 200, probably 160 were black men and women. He owned over 100 buildings, provided housing as a part of the wages for laborers, had their own commissary store, so when they got paid at the end of each day, they got a check. They would take it to the commissary store, deposit it, and then they would use that against the cost of groceries and other things. Then maybe at the end of the month or the end of the season, they could get what was ever left over. And in 1912, this was the largest settlement south of Miami. Princeton was. Here's an incredible picture. The man standing on the ground is Gaston Drake. The men with the mules are all black. And the mules are an interesting story because they were very important for agriculture down here, and lumbering was part of agriculture. These are teams. I had never seen a mule team here before. I've seen pictures of individual mules working in the fields. And I talked to Webster Williams on Saturday, and he said his dad had 2 mules, which he used, and which he boarded in the area where Kendall Baptist Hospital is now during the summer. But he said they never worked as teams, but always as individuals. And we do have several pictures of the mules in the fields. This is a woman working at the Drake Lumber Company, and this was like a lodge, a large home or a lodge, and I would guess she's probably doing laundry. This shows you the scope of the operation. It was a massive operation. They supplied lumber for everything from maybe Palm Beach south to Key West, including Miami Beach. They had their own railroad system. They had 2 locomotives, 12 miles of track, and they moved the track to wherever they needed it to haul the lumber out and bring it to the sawmill in Princeton. The railroad tracks to Key West from Homestead were all over wooden ties, and those were probably all from Princeton. And as they cut the lumber and trees and made lumber out of it, they sold the land as they finished with it. And so there was a time when they just ran out of trees and the sawmill was moved. Almost everybody had to have more than one job in South Florida. The Homestead Canning Company was located in Homestead. It was on Southwest 2nd Avenue near where Brooker Lumber used to be. And Mayor Wallace's grandmother worked there during the season, and as did a lot of other people. Markham Brothers had a canning plant on Packing House Row in Princeton, north of 248th Street, and the Markhams both lived in Homestead. And both canneries existed all the way into the late 1950s. I found them in a 1957 telephone book. Florida City had its own cannery. In fact, I can't remember when it ceased to be in operation, but it was south of Rosita's restaurant in a building that's still standing there. The very first employer was Edward Stiling, who had a cannery in Florida City in the 1920s, and I think he did it mostly from his home. The Civilian Conservation Corps was a very important part of the Roosevelt recovery from the Great Depression. We were amazingly fortunate because in 1933, like he was became president in March, and in 1 month, the CCC was in operation recruiting men. In October of 1933, a unit came to Homestead. In 1934, an all-black Civilian Conservation Corps company came to Cape Sable, which would be a horrible, horrible place to work. There were about 200 men in each company. They were ages 18 to 25. To be eligible, your family had to be receiving relief from the state in which you lived. You had to be single. You got $30 a month, with 25 of it which was sent home. And this was a lot of money at the time. The $5 you got to keep really put you in a strong position with a local young man. I read an interview on the internet of a man who served at Flamingo in a black CCC camp. And it was a long interview, but the interviewer kept probing to determine whether he was treated fairly or not, whether conditions were the same as in other non-black camps. And he really wasn't having any part of that. Two things I did learn from him, though, was that $5 really was a lot of money, and that when it came time to competing with the local guys for the gals, he didn't feel like he was in a secondary position there. Assistant leaders got $36, and leaders got $45, and there were probably like about 4 assistants and 2 in every company. Just like the Army, all the food, medical, and clothing was provided. The men were supervised by Army officers and non-commissioned officers. The technical side of their jobs at Cape Sable and later at Flamingo were provided by the Department of Agriculture, Bureau of Entomology, and Plant Quarantine. They lived in tents, and they removed wild cotton plants, pink bollworm fighters, which was a major threat to our industry. In April of 1934, they all left. I never have determined where they went. They obviously went to another camp in another community. But there were 2 reasons why they left. Mosquitoes, and we know what that's like, and water levels. They came back in December, and there was an article in the local newspaper that talked about 70 plus of them who came to Homestead and other black communities, Florida City, and were hosted by families for Christmas. In 1939, a second CCC camp came, this one to Flamingo, which was much better living. We have a number for it. It was 418C, and that's a small C, and the C equated to colored. So it's easy to pick out the companies. They had the same mission, wild cotton pink bollworm. And as I said earlier, the interview with the worker was disappointing to me because it was just before his death, so it's probably within the last 10 years. And the thrust wasn't, what did you accomplish, but were you treated fairly? And he pointed out that the conditions, he had been a driver at another camp, and so he knew the conditions were the same. And he talked about the $5 being a lot of money, and that every day there was a truck that came into town, which was probably Florida City or Homestead. Believe it or not, we have a picture, an aerial picture of the camp, 1939 in Flamingo. You can see the left-hand corner there, the series of tents around a quadrangle. Had to be very hard work and difficult conditions. While we're talking about camps, during this time we also had tent camps for farm workers. This one was in Goulds. It's kind of hard to make out the tents. This one was a little later, and this one was a Homestead. out toward the base on Campbell Drive. These tents were owned by the Department of Agriculture, brought in by train, set up. Workers lived in them through the season, and then they were put back in the railroad cars and sent to another community. In 1939, something very, very important happened. Again, President Roosevelt was looking to improve the life of people living in rural areas. His Farm Security Administration hired photographers, and they were all well-known photographers, and you've all seen their work. Some of it's really great work. Their job was to come into communities unnoticed, document rural life, take the pictures back to Washington. They were all famous photographers. Marion worked for the Philadelphia newspaper. She came in January of 1939. I know she was unnoticed because there was nothing in the newspaper about her, and had the newspaper known why she was here, there would have been a lot written about it. The next year, this is unbelievable, but $500,000 was appropriated for farmworker housing in Homestead. 250 houses for a white camp, and 250 houses for a black camp out by the base. And that one still exists. This is my favorite picture that she took. This is Southwest 4th Street. This was, at the time, the main street for both the Homestead and Florida City black communities. Everything, all the commercial activity took part along here, and I guess some of it along 5th Avenue as well. The Ritz Theater. This is horrible. This is farmworker housing. And I mean, both black and white farm workers lived in horrible conditions like this. And this is why Congress appropriated enough money to build 500 units of farm worker housing, which is really amazing for the time. This is what the housing looked like. It was built in the early 1940s. The houses don't look very big. They weren't very big. They didn't have bathrooms. They didn't have kitchens. They had like a metal plate on 2 different walls, and the farm workers were expected to provide their own stove. The bathrooms were communal bathrooms. They called them bathhouses, and 1 or 2 of them still exist at Homestead Housing, but have been converted to other uses. But this is what the houses look like. In the 1960s, the federal government said this is unacceptable. They had to be moved away or torn down, replaced, and they were. Some of the ones that were moved away were moved into groves and on farms, and I have personally been in 1 or 2 of these that were moved to be storage sheds. World War II was a very important time in our community. 115 black men and women served their country. I'm going to talk today about just 3 because I knew 2 of the 3 very well, Florida Jackson and Ernestine Jackson Seymour, and their brother A.C. Jackson. Florida became a WAC. She served in the Postal Service, Army Postal Service in France. Now this was not far behind the lines. The postal workers followed closely behind the troops as they moved forward because mail, we didn't have internet then, of course, so mail was really, really important to morale. Ernestine went to Seattle and built Boeing bombers, probably the B-18, I can't remember which bomber. It was the smaller of the 2, not the B-24. But she lived right at the factory where they were being built. What's interesting is that I found a newspaper article which listed many of the black men and women in uniform, and she was listed there, though she wasn't in uniform, she was a civilian. The brother A.C. served in the Army, and based on what Florida and Ernestine told me, he had a difficult time after he left the Army and never readjusted to civilian life. Here's Ernestine in her classroom at A.L. Lewis, standing at the back. I think this looks like about a kindergarten classroom. Ernestine was an incredible member of our community in many, many ways, not just as an educator, but as a leader, as a mother, and She impacted a lot of lives. This is Florida, Jackson Chapman in uniform. You can't see it, but on the bottom right-hand corner is a picture of the brother AC. And in the left-hand corner is a picture of Florida in maybe the last year or two of her life. She came back to Florida City, Homestead, and she was here for a celebration of the Martin Luther King Jr. birthday at Miami-Dade College, and actually appeared with some junior ROTC students and shared her military experiences with them. After the war, she came back, went to college, and spent her entire life working for a cemetery, which must have been a very large one, in Philadelphia. Ernestine became a teacher, and I don't know what AC did. This is one of my favorite pictures, Elijah Childs. He looks like a movie star, and his wife thought he was. He was a handsome guy. And here's Chandler Scurry Childs, his wife, on the left. She's entertaining a group. She was a professional educator, lifetime educator. And that's Danny Phicol with his back to us. And probably around campaign time, but in the right-hand corner, we can't see it, but he wrote in red a nice comment for Mrs. Childs. 1944, the first record we have of voters, black voters being allowed to vote in this area. There was a newspaper article which highlighted it. It said that 70 black voters voted in Goulds, 3 in Homestead. Now, why would it be 70 and 3? Well, the 3 were probably far more courageous than the 70. Goulds did not have a municipal government. Homestead did. The pressure was probably not very great in Goulds against voting. It probably was in Homestead, so we don't know who they were. But the newspaper said that this established a precedent, and thank God it did. Strange thing is, all voted Republican. That would not be happening today. Our schools have been a very, very important part of the community. Now, the pre-A.L. Lewis, I've never been able to find a name for the school. I've seen it in the newspaper, and it's always this way: Homestead, small c, colored, small s school, which tells me it was descriptive and it wasn't the name of the school. A.L. Lewis Elementary was an important part of the community, and there are people sitting in this room who are graduates there, people sitting in this room who taught for almost a lifetime there, and it was really an important school. Laura C. Saunders, same school. Who was A.L. Lewis? Abraham Lincoln Lewis. He was the first black millionaire in Florida. He was from the Jacksonville area. In 1901, he and 7 others formed an insurance company called Afro-American Insurance. He was a big donor to black universities and colleges. He started an entire community for black vacationers and families. It was called American Beach. It was on the ocean, had hotels, restaurants, nightclubs, and then also private homes. He also started a golf course called Lincoln Golf and Country Club. He died in 1947. Jesse Robinson, I spent a lot of time with me helping to compile information. When I asked who A.L. Lewis was, he knew who he was. Had he ever come to Homestead? No. And Jesse said that while he was I think he was vice president of the PTA, that they had given several invitations to A.L. Lewis, which meant it was before 1947, to come to South Dade, but there had never been any contact whatsoever. He never got an answer. Great picture. This is the earliest picture we have of the school, A.L. Lewis School, and it's clearly not the new building, and it's a building that could have been a former CCC building. Another picture of the older wooden buildings. This is the picture of the faculty. May Day, which was an important occasion. And here's Lizzie Melton again on the far right as one of the PTA officers. So her community service went from World War I through World War II. The PTA canned vegetables so that the hot lunch program would have additional food. I've never been able to determine exactly how the buildings at A.L. Lewis came about, but word of mouth is that they were CCC buildings. While we know that Homestead, Cape Sable, and Flamingo had tents, not buildings, Kendall CCC Camp was semi-permanent. It had buildings, so it's possible that they were moved down to Florida City because at that time, I believe A.L. Lewis was on the south side of the street. And moving buildings used to be fairly inexpensive and commonplace. We moved the Florida Pioneer Museum and the depot down here in the 60s. This is what A.L. Lewis looked like, not when it was new in 1952, but just before it was demolished. The reopening of the base had been there during World War II, but there wasn't a single black soldier or airman assigned to the base. In 1953-54, the base reopened as an Air Force base, and this would made a tremendous difference. We had 6,000 people in uniform and another 5,000 dependents come in. Many of the Air Force people were black. It was a service of choice for a lot of black men and women. We had pilots, navigators, mechanics. They handled nuclear weapons and jet engines, the highest technology of the time. And this all happened when our area was still very insular. In 1955, for the first time, two black men ran for office in the city of Homestead. They were Henry Duhart and Raphu Williams. Henry filed first, Raphu filed second. Henry was the owner of Red Dot Cafe, which was on Southwest 5th Street. He was 46 when he came to Homestead, 56 when he ran. He came from Georgia. He was backed by an organization called the Negro Civic League. And his running, he said he wanted to run to make better conditions in the Southwest District. He had a wife and 2 children, and he was the first to file. Raphu was a Tuskegee, an incredible man, Tuskegee grad, master's degree from Boston University, and had done doctoral work at Harvard. He was an Elk, Phi Sigma fraternity, Dade County teachers, 32-degree Mason. In fact, he had been the principal at A.L. Lewis. He established the Williams Hotel, and a really good story is the Homestead police were picking on him, and he just got fed up with it, and he hired a big-time civil rights attorney from Miami. You'll see the picture pretty soon. And the police soon stopped harassing him over little things like parking at the hotel. Again, he had been principal at A.L. Lewis, and he owned not only an ambulance service in Miami, which was a big service. I mean, they had probably more than 5 or 6 ambulances. They owned a filling station, owned limousines as well. This is an actual copy of his campaign poster, which is an amazing, amazing thing to have, and his family provided this. But at the very bottom, you probably can't read it, but it's appropriate today. If you don't vote, don't grumble later. And this is a very favorite picture of mine because this is Raphu Williams with the big-time civil rights attorney G.E. Graves from Miami, and he cleared things up quickly. Another event that had a big impact on the community was the arrival of the Army during the Cuban Missile Crisis. It was a brigade, which is a large organization. They had the most highly technical equipment in the Army. They had air defense missiles, Nikes and Hawks. They had very bright officers. Enlisted men were often college graduates. Mita and I were guests at their reunion in the last 2 or 3 years in Miami, and we were stunned by the educational level. They were probably in a group of 50. There were probably 6 or 7 black PhDs, and they may have been, PhDs even before they were drafted. The soldiers lived in the community, so they had a big impact on our 2 communities. One of my favorite people that I've never met, did not have the pleasure of meeting, Yvonne Howard Brassfield. She was Homestead's first black council member. Amazing story. She was born in 1936, a year after I was. First child of Pearl and James Howard. At age 15, pay attention to this. At age 15, she graduated from George Washington Carver High School in Coconut Grove. She rode a bus, not a school bus, to and from high school in Miami. She graduated at age 20 from Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee, and went to work as a teacher, an elementary school teacher at Phyllis Wheatley in Miami. She married Wilbur Brassfield, who was a musician's agent, and she had a son, Tracy. She was elected in 1975. Now, she was not the first black person to serve in a municipal government in South Dade. That went to Moses Moss, who in 1971, September of 1971, was appointed to fill a vacant seat on the Florida City Commission. And the man who nominated him is sitting in this room. Who nominated Moses Moss? R.S. Shiver. Who seconded it? Howard Thompson. He was elected unanimously. Back to Yvonne. Her students included Otis Wallace, mayor of Florida City, and Roscoe Warren, former mayor of Homestead. She was also the first black person to serve on the James Archer Smith Hospital Board. She campaigned door to door, and this is a direct quote from a newspaper. She said, and I found it hard to believe, but I did confirm this with Mayor Wallace, "I didn't encounter any sign of racial prejudice when I was campaigning. In fact, people were so cordial, I had a hard time getting away from them." Well, Mayor Wallace told me that he worked in her campaign, and she advised him when he ran first in 1976, and her advice was to campaign in the entire community, not just the black community. And unlike her, he had one bad encounter, and I'm not going to relay the details, but he had one bad encounter. She had none. Fundraising put her in the middle of the pack. She raised like almost $1,400. And this is, again, a quote from her. She attributed her election to being a well-qualified person, a Christian but not a fanatic, changing attitudes, and desire for honesty and independence in an elected official. Now, there were 1,200 black voters eligible to vote in Homestead. Half of them came to the polls. She received a little over 1,100 votes, which means that had every single black person who voted for her, she still would have needed 500 and some votes from the white community. She said, this is again a quote, "Black and white was never an issue. I never mentioned it." Tragically, she died in 1989 at age 53. These are the black folks who have served as elected officials in Homestead as commissioners. Moses Moss, again, first appointed September of 1971. It's good to see R.S. Shiver here to acknowledge what he did. And then he obviously had to be reelected because he served until 1976. Otis Wallace, who became a commissioner in 1976, Juanita Smith, Laura C. Saunders, and I have to tell you the story. Laura C. Saunders was the top vote getter, so she became the vice mayor. She sat right next to the mayor. When he was a student and she was the principal, she paddled him. And for good reason. She caught him fighting. So whenever he would, I don't know how to say this properly, but when he would get excited on the dais when he shouldn't, she would kick him underneath, and people couldn't see, but he knew, and he knew that meant cool it for a while here. Israel Andrews, Eugene Berry, who's here with us today, Tommy Dorsett, Benny Lovett, who was an Air Force veteran, I think retired from the Air Force. He was appointed. Darrell Dorsett, Sharon Butler, who's still serving, and Avis Brown. The list in Homestead is shorter, and one of the reasons is because Roscoe Warren served for so long. Yvonne Brassfield was the first, Roscoe Warren second, Norman Hodge, Melvin McCormick, and currently serving Jimmy Williams and Patricia Faircloth. Mayors, Otis Wallace, Roscoe Warren. One of the most influential people in our community and in my life in Homestead was Jesse Robinson Sr. This is Jesse as a young man. And apparently it's taken at the airport or at a base or something. And he's all dressed up, and the backdrop has lots of aircraft in it. This is Jesse kind of in the middle of his life. This is my favorite picture of all. When Jesse was in his 80s, he may have been near his 85th birthday, the news leader asked him to come, and they wanted to interview him for a story. And they asked him to come and get his picture taken. You can't see it, but he's wearing his last First National Bank of Homestead shirt there. And he chose that to be remembered as being a member of the First National Bank. Jesse first became associated with the Losners after the 1926 hurricane. Unfortunately, throughout our history, every time we have a natural disaster, we have looting. And we had looting then. Jesse was a boy then. He went downtown. He actually protected Max's store from looting. And they became fast friends from then on. And when Max purchased the old Bank of Homestead building and furniture and fixtures in 1932, the very first person he hired was Jesse. Jesse's job was to recover as much of the furniture and fixtures as he could. He saved check blanks, stamped them over, stationery. Like so many other people, Jesse had to have outside jobs and businesses to prosper. He raised his children with the help of his mother. When the St. Louis Cardinals wanted to come here in the 1960s and establish spring training for their minor league team, we had segregation. And Jesse signed a contract with the Cardinals, and we have a copy of it, and it's in his book, to provide both housing and transportation for the Cardinals' black players. So again, Jesse stepped up. He was the person that everybody looked to. When anybody was running for office, a visit to Jesse was probably a great suggestion. Jesse was an honorary vice president of the bank when he retired. The trust that the bank put in was incredible. During World War II and after, money did not arrive by armored car. It arrived by post office. And some people here remember that. Jesse would go to the post office by himself, pick up millions of dollars, take it back to the bank. It'd be sorted out for an Army payroll. The Army'd send in like 3 Jeeps with machine guns on them and MPs sitting in every seat to pick up the money that Jesse had picked up, to pick up part of the money that Jesse had picked up at the post office. He was really a trusted man. I'm going to finish by talking about 4 families here. And I've selected them because they represent different segments of the community. The Barrett family, agriculture; the Smith family, construction and public education; the Wallace Marshall family for government; and the Phicol Williams family, and actually going back to his father, the Williams family for business. This is the Simeon and Gertrude Barrett family. This is a picture taken in Miami, and I think they told me that the studio was called Sunshine Something Studio, where everybody went to have their picture taken. This is a beautiful picture. Simeon came from Jamaica by way of Panama Canal, Cuba, and Key West. He was one of the workers on digging the Panama Canal. And as I recall, men from Jamaica seemed to be the best suited and the hardest working workers that they had on the construction of the canal. After he finished work on the canal, he went to Cuba, Key West, and then ended up here in Homestead, where he worked for the FEC Railway, and he probably worked on the a gang that kept the tracks in condition. He married Gertrude Hunter in 1916. She came from the Bahamas, and you can see the black community was really an international community coming from all over. In 1930, he had the foresight to buy 40 acres west of Redland Road, south of 328th Street. If you were, that's kind of like where the Seventh-day Adventist Church is. The children that he and Gertrude had were Martha Harding, named after President Harding, Esther, Charlotte, Solomon, Agnes, George, Ruth, and Irene. And I interviewed both Ruth and Irene, and Irene's husband, Frank. The dad was a farmer, a mason, and a God-fearing man. Ruth remembers that with pride that when she was in school, she was a fighter, and she would fight both boys and girls, and she got paddled often by the principal, Stella Williams. Simeon was a caretaker for an Englishman by the name of Mr. Orr, who owned a fruit grove, and actually the family lived in the fruit grove. And at his death in '82, he was still farming, and he had a crop of okra. Irene's husband, Frank, farmed okra, black-eyed peas, squash, tomatoes, green beans, cabbage, onions, and if you drive by their place, he's got some greens in right now, like 3 or 4 rows of them on the corner. Irene helped prepare produce for the market at home. They built a home on the lot that she would receive from her parents. Their children are Willie, Frank Jr., Tommy, Victor, Daniel, Amos, Mavis, Marcia, and Mark. Ruth married Clarence Thompson. Their children were Juanita, Sandra, Clarence Jr., Michael, Claudette, and Calvin. Ruth sold her lot on Redland Road that her parents gave her to the Seventh-day Adventist Church, where the beautiful church is, now standing. And they told me about other farmers, other black farmers in the area, like James Skinner, Lawrence Gammon, Randolph Milton, Junior Phillips, Otis Davis, Lewis Hicks, Joe Passmore, a man by the name of Lowe, and an ad side. And Lawrence Gammon's son contacted me after the article ran in the newsletter because all of us had the spelling of the name wrong. These are the Barrett Kids, and again, you can see by the backdrop there, photographers had these fancy backdrops that they used, and sometimes you could trace their going through the community by the number of people who had the same backdrop in their photos. Juanita and Thom Smith, great story. Juanita graduated also from Tuskegee Institute in 1947. She was from St. Petersburg. Thom grew up in Sebring. He was a third-generation contractor, which had to be very, very unusual. They married in 1956. In 1967, Thom won the bid to build the new Florida City Seventh-day Adventist Church. He came down first. Juanita and their daughter, Carol, came down later. Juanita taught, but she had to teach all over. I mean, she even taught in Miami Beach until she got like a permanent job, teaching job with Miami-Dade County. They bought 2 triplexes, completed them. Thom built homes down here, the Mount Calvary Baptist Church, and a lot of buildings in Miami. Juanita ran for city commission in 1980 and won, served from 80 to 2008, both as vice mayor and commissioner. This really surprised me. They owned a funeral home in Miami until after Hurricane Andrew, and they just didn't have the energy after that to rebuild their property down here and take care of the funeral home, so they sold it. After Hurricane Andrew, Juanita began volunteering at the soup kitchen, and she has never left. This is a picture of, wonderful picture of Juanita, Carol, and Thom. This is what the original Seventh-day Adventist Church looked like in 1967. This is the beautiful one that Thom built later, and it still is this beautiful. And I talked to Mita today. It looks exactly like our church did where we lived in Glen Burnie, Maryland, Messiah United Methodist Church. I also didn't know that Thom had led revivals, but he did. This was in the 70s and 80s, and he all the way from Perrine South. Mabel Beedles is the grandmother of Otis Wallace. She came in 1910 from the Bahamas via Key West and Homestead. She married Beedles, who was from Live Oak. He was a hard-working man. He worked in Coral Gables for the city. Weekends, he worked for the police reloading ammunition. They had a daughter, Hattie, who was the mother of Otis and his sisters. Hattie and her second husband, Isaiah Marshall, worked in packing houses. So when the season moved and the crops moved, they had to move too. So the kids stayed with Grandma, and Hattie and Isaiah moved to where the work was. Otis, something unusual, alternated schools between Florida City and Harlem, which is near Clewiston. 1 year in Florida City, 1 year in Harlem, until he got to the point where he objected and finished out his education down here. Danny Phicol appointed Otis as a congressional page. I don't know of anybody else from this area who has served as a congressional page. Barbara Jordan, the oldest sister, graduated college and then went to work for Miami-Dade College, became assistant county manager, retired, and now she's a member of the commission, elected member of the Miami-Dade Commission. The youngest sister, Sandy, worked in D.C. for Art Thiel at the Department of Transportation. When Dennis Moss was first elected to the county commission, she served as his chief of staff. She's now the publisher of the Gospel Truth magazine. Otis graduated from Michigan State, worked for the Florida Legal Services, organized a registration drive. He was elected to the commission in 1976, probably as a result of that voter registration line. Graduated the University of Miami Law School in 1977, worked for the public defender, and again he was the top vote getter in 1980. Became the vice mayor, married Greer in 1981, and elected mayor in 1984. The rest is history. This is a beautiful picture. Otis's mother is a beautiful lady, Hattie Marshall on the left, his sister Barbara Jordan on the right, and this is in the Miami-Dade County Commission chambers. This is the entire family. Now, if Otis Wallace standing in the middle of that picture was not spoiled by 6 sisters and a mother and a grandmother, nobody in this world has been spoiled. Otis's mother is a beautiful lady. Here she is. She and his father dissolved their marriage, I could say right after Otis was born, but that would be unfair. But it was after Otis was born. And then she had 3 other daughters with Isaiah Marshall, who Otis says was really a wonderful man. The last family is Randolph and Caroline Williams. This is just a beautiful, beautiful photo. They were a great couple. They came from the Bahamas in 1920. They came to Miami first, then to Homestead. And Randolph was everything. He was a farmer, a minister, owned a rooming house, real estate investor, owner of a combination gas station and restaurant. And we have a picture of it, but it's just not a great picture. It was kind of light because it's very old. They established homes here in Homestead, Miami, and Boston, and they were far ahead of their time. The home they bought in Boston was so their kids could use it while they were in college. Phicol did not go off to college. He remained here. He was an investor. I read somewhere where at age 10 he bought his first piece of property, a vacant lot. He was very instrumental in the establishment of the Skill Center, which provides training and job opportunities for young people. He was also a strong moving force in doing away with distribution of commodities in favor of food stamps, and our community center in Homestead is named for him. Raphu graduated from Tuskegee, Boston University, did postgraduate work at Harvard, principal of A.L. Lewis. He won that big battle with the city of Homestead, ran for city commission in 1955 and lost. Here's his family. He married Charlotte, excuse me. And the daughter on the far right with the plaid skirt is the one who provided a lot of information and photos to me. He married Charlotte Jane Morrison, had several children. They operated the Caroline Hotel and the Williams Boarding House. They owned the first black-owned ambulance service in Miami-Dade County. He was so loyal to Tuskegee Institute that the family complained that every year they had to spend their vacation at one of his reunions, so the kids didn't remember that favorably. and he had a master's degree and did doctoral work at Harvard. This is the Phicol and Lizzie Williams family, Vincent, Virginia, Josephine, and Phicol Jr. Phicol married Lizzie Mae Griffin. They had 4 children. He was a leader in a lot of things happening in this community, including the integration of the school system. And of course, I mentioned the Skills Center and the food stamps and the community center, which bears his name today. And this is Phicol at the bottom, a handsome man, and his son Vincent. And that's it. Thank you all. And I finished on time, which is really amazing for me.